nature's balance. So, the nitrogen cycle is the conversion of nitrogen that is put into various chemical forms, and it powers the atmosphere and all of its biological systems. So, from what we found, nitrogen is basically what provides everything for the ecosystem to survive. So ways we can see variation is how much carbon dioxide we emit in the atmosphere, which is related back to biological diversity. In other words, these biological systems depend on nitrogen for its type of growth. So when there's a limited amount of nitrogen, we begin to see consequences from our atmosphere. As you can see in the picture, this is an example of how the nitrogen cycle works. It starts off by showing nitrogen fixation by the bacteria, and then you see the conversion of ammonia to nitrite, then to nitrate. Then we see the assimilation by plants, which is absorbing nitrogen and incorporating them into plant and animal bodies. And then we see ammonification by the decomposers, which is the cow, that is converting dead organic nitrogen of plants to animals back into ammonia. And with that, we end with denitrification by the denitrifiers, which is releasing gaseous nitrogen into the atmosphere.
Is it still recording? The nitrogen cycle has been changing, and it's affecting our atmosphere and the environment, and human actions play a big role in these changes. The burning of fossil fuels and fertilizer used in agriculture are causing more nitrogen to be emitted into the atmosphere, which is harmful. These changes have led to an increase in greenhouse gases, which causes smog, and is reducing soil fertility, which is causing plants to die off and is causing biodiversity to reduce. There are some plants that work to process and fix nitrogen. These plants support symbiotic nitrogen-fixing microorganisms, and areas that have surplus of these plants are normally areas that are more heavily polluted, caused by humans. These plants, once they die, they release nitrogen, which can be used by other plants, which is more beneficial because it isn't released back into the atmosphere.
Nitrogen that is fixed during fossil fuel combustion is emitted directly into the atmosphere as nitric oxide, which is a key component to acid rain. Agriculture is also another way that nitrogen is emitted into the atmosphere because it reacts with ammonium in plant soil. A surplus of nitrogen in the atmosphere is detrimental to our atmosphere.
Nitrogen saturation is when there's a change in nitrogen coming into a system that exceeds the demand for nitrogen in the system, and it will lead to environmental losses within the system. This is mostly caused from humans doing things such as overexploitation of fossil fuels. You may ask, how does nitrogen saturation play a role in ecosystem function? It plays a larger role in ecosystem functions by exemplifying that when nitrogen is added into an environment, so it is in excess, there's a decrease in growth of plants, which are trees. Production in the ecosystem cannot hold on to the excess nitrogen in the soil because the storage is limited. On the right, there's examples of the effects of nitrogen saturation. To explain these examples further, nitrogen saturation can affect the nitrogen concentrations in lakes and streams, and as well cause reductions in forest growth. This is because excess nitrogen leads to nutrient imbalances. Therefore, it reduces growth and increases mortality rate of plants in nitrogen-saturated ecosystems. Nitrogen deposition is described as the input of nitrogen, which can be in multiple forms into the biosphere. The biosphere is parts of Earth where life exists. There's an example of this in the picture on the right. How does nitrogen deposition affect biodiversity? Well, when limiting nutrients within an ecosystem due to nitrogen deposition, it can alter which species are dominant. Certain species depend on certain nutrients, and when there's a lack in those nutrients, one species may be able to assert dominance over another. Therefore, due to nitrogen deposition, those species who depend on more nitrogen for survival may create a dominance over other plant species. How does nitrogen deposition change within an ecosystem? The loss of diversity due to nitrogen deposition, which was described beside, can produce changes within an ecosystem's functions. Nitrogen deposition promotes changes in productivity rates upon an ecosystem. Studies have shown that species in nitrogen excess ecosystems are less stable when experiencing environmental changes within their ecosystem from results in nitrogen deposition.
Given human-caused acceleration of nitrogen fixation and other changes in nitrogen cycling, it's not surprising that nitrogen concentrations have increased over time in surface waters. Nitrate concentrations have been more measured in many rivers for decades. Analysis of these data show that nitrate has more than doubled in the Mississippi River since 1965, and that nitrate concentrations in major rivers in the northeastern U.S. have increased by 3 to 10-fold since the early 1900s. Acidification can also disrupt the nitrogen cycle in freshwater ecosystems with addition of inorganic nitrogen, which can cause eutrophication. Eutrophication is excess richness of nutrients in a body of water, which causes a dense growth of plant life and death of animal life from lack of oxygen. Eutrophication has substantial effects on the ecosystem function and composition in eustaries, and it can cause anoxia or hypoxia in stratified waters, and it can cause a loss of diversity both in the benthic community and among planktonic organisms. While information on current rates of nitrogen deposition and loss in developed regions is improving, our understanding of these flukes prior to extensive human effects is still patchy. This reflects that all of Earth is more or less affected by human activity. However, studies in southern hemisphere temperate regions illustrate that valuable information on areas that have been minimally altered by humans remains to be gathered. And as you can see to the picture on the right, a large portion of Earth is affected by humans, so to find information on areas that have been minimally altered is a very difficult task.
Infestation is closely tied to human activities that are related to food production. Agriculture is very important for our needs and will continue to rise as the population grows. Fertilizer is the cheapest option, so the rate of making the end fertilizer has grown exponentially because the population has grown. The transfer of inefficient developing properties is crucial so that nitrogen is not being lost in the atmosphere. Improvements of fuel combustion should be implemented to reduce emissions of nitrogen, and developing technologies and economies play the biggest role in our future. The nitrogen cycle provides energy for atmosphere through various chemical forms. Through many human actions such as farming, burning fossil fuels, the nitrogen cycle is being altered and changing. There are types of plants that work to fix nitrogen and release it in ways that is beneficial once they die. However, the long-term exposure of nitrogen to the atmosphere is causing it to break down. It's also causing the aquatic ecosystem to have lacks of influx of oxygen, which boosts the plant life and kills animal life. However, we cannot compare the environment with how nitrogen has affected by humans now to before human pollutions. In the future, developing technologies will be playing a big role in how many emissions will release into the atmosphere. And this is our works cited.